Camelot, the new frontier, American royals. No family has loomed so large for so long in the American imagination, so thoroughly embodied the aspirations of so many generations for a better future. But the myth we all know and love hides dark secrets, and this document is the first step in proving it. Let's talk about the Kennedys.
So, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
You know them, 3 smart, charismatic, handsome sons who would make for 3 U.S. senators, an attorney general, and of course, a president. 3 brothers who symbolized a new era of political leadership and, through soaring speeches and spirited ambition, helped to realize the dreams of the civil rights movement, put a man on the moon, and so much more. And yet, despite all they accomplished, the Kennedys are remembered as much for the tragedies they suffered.
3 shots were fired. President Kennedy died.
The body of Senator Robert Kennedy is now in the air.
Some awful curse did actually hang over all the Kennedys.
But there's 2 problems with this story. The first is that it's just that, a story. In this case, one carefully crafted to conceal the history of lies, theft, and unbelievable vice which built this supposedly virtuous dynasty. That's where this document comes in. And second, even as the Kennedys did fall victim to tragedy, it's too easy to forget, as so many have, the tragedies inflicted by these men on those around them. Wives discarded, a daughter lobotomized, a woman killed, marriages destroyed, childhood stolen, and families broken, including their own. This is the story of the lies that built America's royal family. These are the dark secrets of the Kennedys. This document is the birth certificate of the Kennedy dynasty. It's a law passed by Congress in the wake of modern history's largest economic disaster, the Great Depression. It's the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, and it was designed to prevent something like the Depression from ever happening again, and that required reining in Wall Street, where thousands of people bought, sold, and built up bubbles of false confidence in shady investments, which, once they popped, brought the whole economy crashing down. So the act established a bunch of rules, which basically amounted to no fraud allowed, along with an agency, the SEC, to enforce them. What does all this have to do with the Kennedys? Well, Joe Kennedy, father to the famous trio, would be the SEC's very first chair, and this would be the dynasty's debut on the national political stage. Born to an affluent but socially downcast Irish Catholic immigrant family of lowly East Boston, Joe was a climber. As a young man, he wooed Rose Fitzgerald, daughter to a Boston political heavyweight. Even more extraordinary for his background, he was accepted to Harvard and shortly after graduating became the president of a bank at age 25. Before he'd turned 50, he'd multiplied his wealth many times over, amassing a fortune worth billions in today's dollars. But, as the story goes, all that money he'd earned was just a launchpad for what he really cared about, serving the people. Before long, his ambition and generous fundraising captured the attention of President Roosevelt, who needed someone to helm the government's unprecedented wrangling of Wall Street and saw in Kennedy the best bet for chairman because of executive ability, knowledge of habits and customs of business to be regulated, and ability to moderate different points of view on the commission. So Kennedy served the public and made his mark. In return, he received praise, both from the left for reining in reckless speculation and the right for stabilizing Wall Street and ultimately protecting investments. But perhaps his biggest fan was FDR himself, who in 1938 appointed Kennedy U.S. ambassador to Britain, a job of no small importance with war looming in Europe.
Now, these days, Roosevelt really wouldn't need Kennedy for much, After all, why send an ambassador when you can control any of your devices from anywhere in the world at any time with AnyDesk, the sponsor of this video and longtime friend of the channel. AnyDesk is an amazing program that lets you control faraway devices as if they were right there in the room with you. Whether you need to print some documents remotely, help a family member troubleshoot some tech woes, grab some files off another computer, or just do something quick in a desktop program from your tablet, AnyDesk has you covered with lightning-fast responsiveness even on the slowest internet. Better yet, it's not just for Kennedys and Roosevelts. AnyDesk is actually totally free for personal use, which means that checking it out at anydesk.com/spectacles is a great way to support the channel without spending a dime. We use it all the time to make these videos and seriously recommend it. It's super easy and super useful. So, for globe-spanning, near telepathic powers FDR could only dream of, that's anydesk.com/spectacles. Link in the description. Thank you, AnyDesk. Now, back to World War II. Within about a year of Kennedy's appointment, Britain could no longer avoid Hitler's warmongering, and by the time the bombs began to fall on London, Kennedy fled not to the bomb shelter, but to the countryside. Meanwhile, he gave frightened interviews professing that democracy is finished in England, and that it would soon be in America, too. In the words of a British Foreign Office internal memo, "Whilst we do not regard Mr. Kennedy as anti-British, we consider that he is undoubtedly a coward." Importantly, Joe Kennedy was a coward because he didn't care about anybody beyond himself. When Roosevelt recalled him for embarrassing the administration, he nearly broke his relation off with the president, before eventually endorsing his bid for a third term. But he didn't do it out of love for the New Deal, or the war on Wall Street, or Roosevelt's other anti-poverty measures. No, Kennedy's ideology was opportunism. His loyalties lay with whoever or whatever could get him ahead, and in 1940, Roosevelt and the overwhelmingly democratic Irish Catholic community were his only option.
Moreover, Joe's origin story is founded on lies and hypocrisy. He might have been a son of hardscrabble East Boston, but Kennedy's first home with Rose was decorated with wedding gifts including a marble statue of Napoleon, priceless paintings by Rembrandt, and a grand piano, among so much else. Nor was he some anti-Wall Street hero. In fact, Kennedy was a big part of the problem. At least once, he constructed fraudulent trading schemes, passing off one company's stocks, of which he owned many, as those of another, completely unrelated and much more valuable company. And on countless occasions, he bought and sold investments with the help of private insider information before it was made public, allowing him to game the stock market at the expense of the public. Defenders of Kennedy object that these practices weren't illegal until the Securities Act of 1934 made the rules, and after all, Kennedy enforced them. Except all the 1934 Act did was make fraud illegal. Just because fraud had been legal doesn't render it, or Kennedy, any less repugnant. He was an enthusiastic player in the speculative financial games that brought down the world economy and impoverished millions, while his own fortune remained intact and even grew. Leveraging that wealth into political influence and shutting the door behind him hardly balanced the scales. Still, Kennedy's integrity was not the only casualty of his ambition. In fact, in day-to-day life, he more or less abandoned his wife Rose, a useful stepping stone to influence, as he pursued his ever-growing lust for power and for other women in increasingly public affairs with countless lovers, from secretaries to movie stars. However, if Joe Kennedy had but one virtue, it was his love for his children. Though World War II took his eldest, he was still left with 3 other sons, all 3 of them Joe guided carefully, at times forcefully, into political careers, but it was the oldest of them, John, upon whom he would stake his highest hopes. A decorated veteran, John Fitzgerald Kennedy could present himself as more than just some fortunate son. By 1946, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Just 6 years later, he won a seat in the Senate. And within 4 years of that, he, with his father's guidance, set his eyes on the presidency. Winning the 1960 election would be a lift, however. He was up against other, more senior Democrats gunning for the party's nomination, and even if John won that, he'd still be facing Richard Nixon, Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, an experienced legislator bearing the torch of a popular president and war hero. But John had a lot going for him. First, his family, his beautiful wife, Jackie, their telegenic kids, and his brothers, Robert and Edward, accompanied John as he crisscrossed the nation. By now, most Americans had television sets, and they couldn't resist the allure of these handsome and charismatic young men, so radically different from the competition.
In 14 weeks of campaigning, Senator Kennedy attracts enormous crowds.
But John didn't just look different. He spoke about politics like nobody else. At the 1960 Democratic National Convention, he laid out his plan, the New Frontier, promising that with courage, not complacency, he would lead and lead vigorously and abandon the safe mediocrity of the past. He vowed that he would tackle the issues of race relations, poverty, and growing Soviet power with the deftness of one raised in this rapidly changing world, not the stale caution of his old opponents. It worked. John won the nomination, and then the presidency, ushering in an utterly new way of doing politics in America. Except, there's more to this story. Yes, John was a compelling candidate on paper, but after 14 years in Congress, his only accomplishment was earning a reputation for absenteeism. It's hard not to wonder whether the New Frontier was a serious program for change or the beautiful words of a handsome man who had no real idea what he was doing.
But what about his perfect family? Well, today, it's hardly any secret John was pathologically unfaithful to his wife, his affairs too numerous to count. You may think that's bad, but normal for a politician of that era. But while that may be true, John's infidelities were uniquely ubiquitous and juxtaposed against the centrality of his family to his political image, more hypocritical and damning. Moreover, the profound misogyny of the Kennedy men didn't end with their spouses. Even those of their own blood paid a price. In 1958, just as John was gearing up to run for the presidency, the family's public facade faced a grave threat as questions were raised about John's conspicuously private sister, Rosemary. At first, her father claimed she was teaching at a convent, then that she worked with mentally disabled children at a special school, before finally admitting that Rosemary had been struck by spinal meningitis at a young age and was mentally disabled herself, a difficult truth to extract from the family image-obsessed Joe. Except it was all a lie. True, Rosemary had some sort of mental disability since birth, and as a result, she behaved in ways that worried Joe she could become an obstacle to her brother's careers. So in 1941, without consulting his wife, and against the warnings of the American Medical Association that the procedure was far too experimental, Joe Kennedy had his own daughter lobotomized, a procedure whereby the brain is intentionally mutilated to impart docility. The lobotomy was botched, if it's even possible not to botch such a barbaric operation, permanently giving Rosemary the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, rendering her incontinent and incapable of speech. After that, she was institutionalized, where Joe kept her hidden, both from the public and most of her own family, for decades. At the same time Joe was lying to the public about Rosemary's fate to protect his son's career, he wrote her caretakers in faraway Wisconsin, "The solution of Rosemary's problem has been a major factor in the ability of all the Kennedys to go about their life's work." Whether Joe divulged the truth even to his other children remains unclear, but it's hard not to see those images of that perfect Kennedy family differently. All those charismatic young men and women, and think of Rosemary, sacrificed on the altar of her father's and siblings' success, or Jackie, repeatedly humiliated to placate her husband's insatiable hedonism.
There is a lot more to be said about John and his brother Bobby's lives and times and their era-defining assassinations, but much of it has already been said enough elsewhere. Less talked about, however, is the survivor, the youngest boy, Ted. Viewed from one perspective, Ted's life serves as a redemption of his father's and brother's sins, a resolution of the contradictions in their own lives. Joe was an opportunist. John was more well-meaning, but he liked to showboat. These were not vices shared by the youngest Kennedy, at least not to the same extent. Ted's Senate tenure, which began in 1963 and ended with his death in 2009, is the 5th longest in American history, and he took it seriously. For example, after his own close brush with death in a plane crash in 1964, Ted was confined to a hospital bed for months, where he surrounded himself with economists and policymakers, working with them to hone his understanding of key domestic issues.
Among them, he studied healthcare policy, which became central to his career as he spent decades fighting for increased access to care and, ultimately, the unrealized dream of a national public healthcare system. He also made his mark on education policy and international politics, leading the charge against South African apartheid and helping broker peace in Northern Ireland. Now, whether Ted's politics or policies were right or wrong is immaterial. Importantly, his dedication was serious, and he established a reputation not for absenteeism, but for practical acumen in making change happen.
The soul of the Democratic Party and the lion of the United States Senate.
However, a genuinely respectable political career is not the entirety of Ted Kennedy's story. He may have resolved some of his father's and brother's political sins, but when it came to personal vices, he hardly escaped the Kennedy curse. The first of these was, of course, the extramarital affairs. Although he wasn't quite the womanizer that his older brother was, in some ways his philandering was more public, thanks in part to advancing media technology and increasing social scrutiny of such vices. And whereas John and Joe's affairs could occasionally appear glamorous when they were courting movie stars, Ted's were emphatically not, caught with a lobbyist in a coat room in the 1980s or harassing a waitress with another senator around the same time. But unlike his father and brother, Ted also drank, a habit which would contribute to perhaps the darkest chapter of his life.
So far, the tragedy on Martha's Vineyard has raised more questions than have been answered.
Back in 1969, just a year after his brother Robert's assassination, Ted attended a party for Bobby's campaign staffers, something between a thank you event and a commiseration, on Chappaquiddick Island, near Martha's Vineyard. It's unknown how many drinks Ted had that night, but as the party ran late, one of the staffers, Mary Jo Kopechne, worried she might miss the last ferry off the island. Ted offered her a ride. What happened after that isn't entirely clear. According to Ted's own testimony, he took a wrong turn onto a dirt road. Crossing a bridge down that way, he suddenly lost control of the car, which skidded off and into a tidal pool. Ted escaped the overturned, submerged car, but claimed he was unable to rescue Kopechne despite his efforts. Terrified and unsure what to do, he returned to the party and asked two of his friends for help. None of these men, they were all men, contacted the authorities, though they both later claimed they urged Ted to do so. Instead of seeking professional help, they returned to the site of the accident where they attempted once more to rescue Kopechne before Ted gave up and returned to his hotel. The next morning, a passerby spotted the car, and at 9 a.m., Mary Jo Kopechne's body was recovered. Only now, as word got around, did Ted inform the police of his involvement, later saying,
"My conduct and conversations during the next several hours, to the extent that I can remember them, make no sense to me at all. I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident to the police immediately."
Claiming, essentially, that he was out of his mind. The Chappaquiddick incident, as it came to be known, deserves a video itself, but suffice to say that subsequent investigations suggest a number of damning details. That Ted was driving the car at a dangerous speed, and that Kopechne may have been alive in the car for as long as a half hour after the accident. Had Ted, instead of sobering himself up before turning himself in, opted to call police as soon as he could, it's likely Kopechne would have lived. There was naturally a court inquiry, but being a Kennedy, Ted got off scot-free. His formal sentence of 2 months for leaving the scene of the accident was suspended, meaning he served no time. Looking at Ted's life in its totality, beyond just Chappaquiddick, we see a complicated yet largely predictable life. On the one hand, it's no surprise he exhibited the same misogynistic exploits found in his father's example, nor is it any wonder, given the emotional and professional burdens he bore, that he was prone to reckless behavior. Indeed, Ted Kennedy, blessed as he was with wealth, hardly escaped misfortune, cursed to live through the violent deaths of his 3 older brothers, each in their prime, shadowed by the ambitions of an overbearing father and all-consuming family reputation, and charged with responsibilities he seems never to have truly desired nor felt himself worthy of. Yet, Ted Kennedy is not merely a victim, nor is he a hero, nor is he a villain. Through the privilege of his youth, he was sheltered from consequence. Through the direction of his father, he was sheltered from choice. And through the privilege of his brother's heroic reputations, he was sheltered from scrutiny. In turn, he led a life of profound recklessness.
But Ted experienced something his brothers didn't. He lived long enough to face public scrutiny, to fall out of favor and out of the spotlight to reevaluate his decisions. It's here, late in Ted's career, at the family's proverbial low point of public reputation, that the Kennedy myth, paradoxically, found its truest realization as Ted, without fanfare, carved out his role as the workhorse of the Senate. It's also at this time that Ted remarried and seemingly found fulfillment in a faithful relationship, a first for men of his lineage. Importantly, the same lesson is found among the Patriarch's daughters, like Eunice, who, perhaps inspired by her sister Rosemary, directed her father's foundation away from Catholic charities and toward research on intellectual disabilities, before going on to help found the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development and the Special Olympics. The point of all this isn't to say that the Kennedy myth is a lie because they are uniquely evil people. Instead, it's a lie because they are simply people, if especially flawed. The danger of the heroic lie, though, isn't primarily that it blinds us to others' faults, but that it blinds them to their own. That's why it's late in Ted's life, and in the lives of the Kennedy women, that here, shorn of the mythos, one finds any realization, however partial, of the promise for which so many loved this tragic family.